discussion about the centrality of anti-caste traditions to taking further Indian radical thought. So, as you know, that what I've tried to do over the last two sessions is to view Gail's life work in and through a feminist lens. What that means is, of course, to take her feminism as a starting point for her subsequent writings and to trace the way in which she stayed with feminist concerns till almost the very end. And hopefully, the sample of writings that you've been handed out captures some of that. I mean, there's a lot of her work, of course, but I just chose a very representative sample that would help us understand how she sort of carried these concerns over the decades. That's one thing. And second thing is that her enduring commitment to equality and justice, though she, in one of her very last essays, which I sort of asked you to read, she keeps reminding us that equality and justice cannot remain generalities, that they have to be rethought in every instance, and they are not trans epochal values, as she says. And each historical conjuncture has to breathe life into them in rather specific ways. So, but at the same time, it's evident that these two values matter to her. Equality and justice matter to her. And I think, in terms of how she viewed them unfolding in women's lives, is also something which is important to remember in today's context. And I think for any number of reasons, but also because sometimes that aspect of women's lives, that they are providers, laborers, producers, is sort of folded into women's own gendered destiny, Um, while earlier it was folded into their sex destiny, that their bodies made them out to be reproducers, and that fact is fundamental. And the entire politics of reproduction that feminists sort of uh, brought into public debate, that has been the context in which feminist concerns were discussed, whether it's sexual violence, whether it's women's rights to sexual orientation, choice. All of that was sort of theorized or sought to be understood from within the realm of sexual reproduction. And subsequently, of course, we've unpacked the whole sex gender thing even further. And today we are sort of seeing a very rich debate and activism around uh, issues of gendered identity itself. What does it mean to be male, female, or other, and so on? And I think what perhaps we have not always kept in focus is the fact of women as fundamentally laboring beings, also, whether they perform domestic labor or the kind of work they perform outside the house. And I think Gail's work makes us come back to that aspect of their social existence, of their, let's say, of their being itself, which continues to shape their lives in very many fundamental ways. And we saw that so vividly during lockdown, how the fact of material uh, uh, existence being rendered so unstable, what that did to a majority of our citizens, and how women particularly had to engage with that in so many different ways. So, and I think so Gail's concern with women's lives was through this prism of women as providers, producers, and laborers. And so, therefore, for her, equality had to do with women's access to land, independent access to land, not just equal access to land. And of course, in terms of what one might expect from a capitalist system, fair wages, with all that fair wages entailed, and equality of opportunity in terms of education, and of course, female sexual and social autonomy. And her work, especially with single and widowed women, of which we read last time. And I think that's an area of thought that's very, very interesting, and which we haven't really spent too much time thinking through as feminists, not simply in terms of their singleness, but what does it mean to be a citizen in that sense? What sort of claims can you make? And a hut of one's own, a house of one's own, and that opens up an entire area of thinking about rights itself. And how might that then be disaggregated into practical demands, the ration card and a host of other things. And recently, our government in Tamil Nadu has announced that single women can have their own ration cards, for which we're very glad. Of course, they put in other conditionalities which don't make us very glad, but you don't have to be a familial being to access state resources. So, and I think Gail was one of the very few people who very early on started speaking about what does it mean to be a citizen who's unattached to a family or a kinship or a caste network. And I think that was also very, very interesting. And then, of course, the right to think, which is something that she asserted from very, very early on, drawing from Mahatma Phule's dictum that to think is to be free, that knowledge is Vidya, as he called it, as opposed to Shastra, as Gail would tell us, is something that liberates the mind and liberates all of us. And most important, I think, something we see as so central today, debates about the future of Indian agriculture on the one hand and the future of our environments. And I think that work she's done on sustainable living, which is not fundamentalist at all. It is not about a kind of a romantic sense of the environment, or an investment in ecological concerns that moves away from the need for the poor and the marginal to have access to healthy food and healthy living and the environment. She manages to hold the two together, and I think that's important. And the way she creatively thinks through that, appropriate technology on the one hand, decentralized decision making in terms of what you grow and how you grow. Some of it might be utopic, and she was aware of that. But as if you've read Seeking Begumpura, she makes such a rich case for utopian thought. It's not simply a digression from the present, it's also what keeps the mind alive and active. So I think in that sense, her feminism is very central to how she sort of worked her way through different historical moments. So we've seen a bit of that, and today I think what I would like to do is to sort of mark that movement into another realm, the movement from feminism into a realm where she hoped that feminism itself would acquire a certain richness and become the basis for an integrated way of looking at the world. So feminism is not simply whatever she's been doing until now, but that it also gathers something more from being part of and aligning itself with anti-caste traditions. And while she also points that direction to the left, and I think she perhaps did not imagine that the left would take it as seriously as feminists were likely to take it. Because I think, in terms of the things she wrote in the 90s and after, you see that very clearly. So much of what we've been reading until now, except for a couple of essays from the 90s, really belong to that time when she was engaged with the Indian left, whether it is the parliamentary left or whether it's the Marxist Leninist groups or with what she calls the non traditional left. Lots of groups that had emerged across the country, and she kept up a very earnest conversation with them. Critical, something that sort of she disagreed with some of their premises, many of their conclusions, but it was a conversation. And one thread that runs through it is that you need to rethink the gender question, you need to rethink the caste question, not simply because you can then attach them to your overall agenda, but because you need to do that to transform your agenda itself so that your agenda itself starts looking different. And I think she didn't quite succeed in inciting anyone from within the very broad left to actually think very consistently on caste, though she did say that the Naxalites were invested in doing so for some part of the time. And we do know at least that some individuals who identified with the broad left, like say the late K. Balagopal, while he sparred with her on a number of issues, also learned from her. And I think his own concern that civil liberties ultimately has to be grounded in an anti-caste perspective, perhaps also owes to this sort of moment that Gail opened up in the 70s and 80s, I think. So you do have some sort of a space that Gail managed to sort of open up for those that were invested in communist theorizing. But I don't think, on the whole, the Indian left has invested enough time and energy in thinking through some of the issues that she has raised. And but I think Gail therefore felt that the feminists had perhaps greater stake in wanting to do so. And if you see, from the 90s onwards till the 2000s, her work stops referencing debates within socialism in any fundamental way, but stays with feminism in a fairly consistent way. Because I think she saw feminists as perhaps the most ideal constituency to engage with the anti-caste traditions. And by feminists, of course, she had in mind conscious thinking people who she might agree with or not agree with, but who were earnest and committed to a politics of emancipation. and she might feel that their understanding of caste was insufficient, or she might think that they had not really rethought their own upper caste biases, which unthinkingly they carry forward. Nevertheless, she felt that urban feminist groups or urban feminist thinking and working were not to be seen as people that were beyond the pale of any kind of emancipatory project, and or that they were simply reflecting their own caste and class positions unthinkingly. So she still had that sense of feminism as a constituency you could speak to. And the two essays that I had asked you to read, the review essays, book reviews, Myths and Markets, and her review of Uma Chakravarti's book on Ramabai. I think there you see that, and she points to what is lacking in Myths and Markets. I think that's a very important thing, but because what she's basically pointing to is, you've gone that far, why are you not going further? Right? So the feminist critique of nationalism she welcomes. The feminist critique of the upper caste biases of Indian nationalism she sort of endorses. But then she says that should then logically push you to engage with others who were also critical of nationalism. But here your engagement has been selective, she says. You've engaged with the left, but not with the anti caste traditions. And you continue to sort of not pay attention to them, much as the nationalists had done in the past and the communists had done in the past. So now pick up that conversation, is what she's saying, because clearly you have common ground with them, because both of you reject nationalism on the ground that it does not address caste and family. And if you put caste and family together, you see that you have a very unique structure of exploitation and oppression in the Indian context. And without devaluing class politics, without devaluing the fight against imperialism or capitalism, uh, why is it that we find it hard to make that move towards engaging with anti caste thought? And you must. And then she holds up Uma Chakravarti's book as an example that does that. And both these essays were written in 2000. So, and it's very, very interesting that she continues to hope and imagine feminists would be the ones to do that. And she sort of comes to that question also very briefly in her introduction to Seeking Begumpura, where she says these utopian traditions hold lessons for feminism, and feminists themselves have contributed to those traditions. So, and I think there's something very poignant there, because until the time Umar wrote, or some others were writing on caste and gender from southern India, you really don't have a sort of systemic, conceptual view of caste, class, and gender emerging within feminist scholarship. In feminist practice, you may have a lot of that, because you can't obviously ignore it on the ground. But to systematically think through it, I think did not happen enough, though people like Gail have been pointing in that direction from the 70s onwards. And of course, it sort of emerged in two ways, one within women's studies and scholarship, and one with the emergence of Bahujan Dalit feminism itself. And that kind of cross fertilization Gail had in mind between these two traditions is yet to take place in the Indian context. But I think with Gail's work, you can see the, or at least acknowledge the necessity for it. And how might we take that forward? So that's something those two essays point us towards. And I'll come back to them in a minute. But basically, what I want us to notice is that transition from her earnest and sustained engagement with the left to an earnest and sustained and extremely sort of, for want of a better word, a happy engagement with the anti-caste traditions. And I use the word happy because I think finally you see that Gail has found a philosophical home for herself. While she indicates that this is where she would like to be, she doesn't sort of work through that consistently till the 90s. And her dissertation did that on Mahatma Phule and Satyashodak Samaj. And she wrote about Phule in the EPW from 1971 onwards. And the essay that I had asked you to read is a very rich essay on Phule, and that's the germ of her dissertation, really. So, but while she references Phule and she keeps going back and forth on the Satyashodak Samaj, she doesn't engage with that tradition except in terms of how it shapes local practices. But then what happened, what you find her doing in the 1990s is very interesting. Even as she's sort of in this very difficult position of supporting a farmers' movement in the face of a lot of criticism from the left and from some other groups, she also moves back from the farmers movement a bit. You see that in her writings on women and the farmers movement, where her interest is really in what the women are saying rather than in what the movement as a whole is saying. And of course, she has her own take on how do you read this demand for, and I spoke about this last time, for remunerative prices, for farmers to engage directly with the commodity market and so on. And she sets herself against what she calls bureaucratic upper caste state systems, and which are really anti people and set against the Bahujan Dalit communities and women and so on. And she sometimes goes the whole hog to make us see the virtues of any of market socialism. So that's one part of her writings, but she does not take that beyond a point. Mid 90s, she stops. She doesn't really go back to that in a fundamental way. The farmers' movement, also, as it existed at that time, suffers a retreat for various reasons. So you see that in the 90s, what she then does is she consolidates. So she's been saying all of this stuff. So in a book like Reinventing Revolution, which I hope you all read sometime, and I said this earlier too, she places all these movements in conversation with each other. And I think that is very, very interesting because basically she feels that there is an en passe in each of these movements. But that en passe perhaps comes from the way they have located themselves. In some ways, it is sort of inevitable given their location. Some ways, they have also held themselves tight there because they are not pushing their limits. But if you place them next to each other, you see what are the pieces in the jigsaw puzzle that you need to fill. But unlike most jigsaw puzzles, those pieces are not there. You have to, it's not a question of searching for them. You have to create them. They don't exist yet. Those connections have to be created. And I want to quote from a piece that she wrote, and I discovered this essay. I wish I had discovered it earlier, but it's very hard sometimes to know what all and where all she wrote. So this was a very short piece she wrote in Down to Earth, the ecological magazines. And I'm going to quote, this is a very short piece. And basically, she wrote it on the occasion of Mahatma Phule's 100th or 101st death anniversary. And she spoke of the fragmentation of Phule's vision because Phule was a very sharp critique of British policies on agriculture, land. At the same time, he welcomed Western education. He felt British rule was not as hostile to lower caste and Dalit interests as it perhaps was to the upper caste and so on, at least in Maharashtra. And Gail would often point out that he didn't have a critique of colonialism. But then she would also say, but that's such a critique did not emerge until much later, even across the world. Phule was by then, not here. In any case, she talks about the fragmentation of Phule's vision. He had a very sound understanding of agriculture. Culturally, he was for sort of drawing from Bahujan Dalit traditions, and he granted a centrality to the gender question. And he saw women fundamentally as producers, as thinkers, as people who had actually responsible for sustaining life. He had sort of challenged the form of the blood and lineage caste family. He didn't have a child of his own. He adopted a foundling child born to a Brahmin widow. And he spoke of this ideal family as a place where one could be, mother could be Satyashodak, father could be Muslim, child could be Christian. It's a very famous quote. So, in that sense, she felt Phule was so central to the Indian revolutionary dissenting tradition. But what had happened to Phule's in her legacy? And I think what her understanding of that captures perhaps the kind of situation that she felt existed in India in the 90s. I'm just going to read a very short quote. It is. I quote, Dalit and low caste radicals quote Phule's scathing attacks on Brahmanism without dealing with his analysis of peasant exploitation. Dalits and low caste radicals quote Phule's scathing attacks on Brahmanism without dealing with his analysis of peasant exploitation. Sharad Joshi, the farmers' leader with whose Shetkari Sangatna she was most closely aligned with, focuses on peasants but avoids stressing the caste aspects of Gulamgiri. Right? And very interesting, Madhav Gadgil and Ramachandra Guha, that's the time that famous book on the history of India ecology was published. Madhav Gadgil and Ram Guha cite Phule's descriptions of the interdependence of forests, grasslands, and cultivation in traditional village society. But do not worry whether Fule's total vision contradicted the thesis of the ecological functions of caste. So she felt that there was all this stuff that women were doing around environmental struggles in Chipko, in localized struggle, but where was the theory? And the theory that was advanced was lacking in a caste perspective. This fragmentation of vision reflects the disconnected, inchoate, conflicting state of the movements themselves. So, this is what she has to say at that time. And interestingly, she doesn't bring feminism into the argument. I think that's because all along she's pointed out that feminism has a potential, but it has to really build on it. But what's important is, therefore, she sees the need for these movements to be all aligned in some fashion, but she knows that this alignment cannot be mechanical. How do you do it? You can't just sort of pause it for an alliance. It's not going to happen. There are so many contradictions, and she would be the first one to acknowledge that. So, what do you do with that? That's one thing. The second thing is, as we all know, the period from the announcement of the Mandal Commission findings and the adoption of the Mandal Commission report by the VP Singh government and the subsequent events, the destruction of the Babri Masjid, the coming of the Bharatiya Janata Party to power, and they stayed in power till almost the early 2000s, right? To 2006, I think. And that was a very crucial period for Indian history. So today, when we sort of despair over what's going on, it's very, very interesting to read Gail, who wrote exactly this whole utopian stuff during those years. Much of that was written during the Mandal Masjid years, particularly during the tenure of the BJP government in power under Atal Bihari Vajpayee. So that's also something interesting to keep in mind. And but so you have reinventing revolution, which sort of coincides with this quote that I sort of read out to you. And then a book that she wrote immediately the next year was Dalits and the Democratic Revolution. It's very interesting. She seems to have worked back to back on both those books, and both of them are significant tomes, right? They're not simply essays. Each of them is about 350 pages. And in reinventing revolution, she of course puts all these movements together. But in Dalits and the Democratic Revolution, she is sort of coming to this. This was one kind of a synthesis. Here you have another kind of reckoning, which is also a point of departure. So this synthesis of various movements, she would continue to sort of come back to in different ways. But what she does in Dalits and the Democratic Revolution is very interesting, because one of the first chapters talks of towards a historical materialist theory of caste. So basically, she says what we lack is an understanding of caste that is not simply about caste being a superstructural element. And here's a quarrel with the left. The second thing is to understand exploitation itself. So, exploitation is simply not only in terms of property or the creation of surplus value. It is also about, and this is something we saw last time, about how women's unwaged labor and primitive accumulation, the Adivasis being dispossessed, together constitute the conditions for capitalism. So it's not simply that the proletariat or the extraction of surplus through the play of capital that we need to be paying attention to, but to all these other things. She had said that already. She'd been talking about that. So here, what she does is she sort of takes those two things together, and she asks herself the question: if exploitation is this, and if you have a situation where caste society mediates this process, right, of primitive accumulation on the one hand, and of using unwaged labor, and of subordinating agriculture to industry and all of that. And women's labor is central to all these things, right? So if that's the case, then where do you start thinking about change? So you don't have the proletariat. They are not the singular agents of revolution. The Communist Party itself cannot be seen as the vanguardist party when it is significantly silent on what Gail thinks ought to be the vanguard, which is the peasants and the agricultural workers and the women. And they can't simply be a class. So, especially because they are divided by caste, they're divided by gender, how do you then constitute a class? And that leads her to think maybe class cannot be the basis for them coming together. What can be the basis for them coming together? And that is what she explores in Dalits and the Democratic Revolution. So, what can be the basis for these variously dispossessed people, these variously exploited and oppressed people to come together? Class is not a useful category for her. And the farmers' movement, she had seen how some things are possible, but some things don't change. Gender is addressed partially, but not fully. The caste question remains a very fraught thing in the peasant economy. So maybe everybody unites around building a dam, but beyond that, right? Everybody unites around asking better wages and better prices, but beyond that, what? When it comes to family, when it comes to social thought, when it comes to the kind of sociability that's possible, women and Dalits are constantly sort of made to give up things rather than um, being seen as people from whom you can learn and do things. So therefore, for her, the farmers peasant movement also has sort of appears to be fraught in some ways. As for the ecological movements, it's been very hard to sustain them in just because of the power of the state, the power of capital, and there is no conceptual worldview to help us think about these movements in a complex way. She quotes Vandana Shiva, she quotes others, but she finds them all wanting somewhere. So in your readings, I also have a folder called synoptic readings. It's basically for people who want a sort of a shortcut guide to Gail. And there I have this long essay of hers called Violence Against Women, where she also offers a very interesting critique of Vandana Shiva's work. So basically, she did not think that class can be a basis of the exploited and the oppressed coming together. She does not think that these movements offer a way of thinking about fighting exploitation or creating social conditions to fight exploitation. So therefore, what she does is drawing from what you call in the West the post-communist critics, those that stay with socialism but move away from the idea of the working class being a vanguard. In any case, in India, after 1960s China and Mao's own endorsement of the peasant-centric revolutions that were important for Asia, in Asia at least nobody really imagined that the working class alone could lead the struggle. But on the other hand, the whole union of peasantry and the industrial proletariat was a kind of mantra that the communist parties kept talking about. So they didn't really unpack that in a very nuanced or a particular manner. So that didn't really lead to a way of thinking about what else can you say about the peasantry. So and Gail points that out in all her writings in any case. So what she then found useful about this post-communist critique emerging from a new generation of communists was their statement, and she here quotes this very famous book which was popular in the 80s by Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, if I remember right. And they draw from Gramsci, but they draw also from a lot of other stuff. But basically, they make a claim for renewing our understanding of equality and justice. What Gail would later say, these are not trans epochal values, but they are values that we need to rethink in every epoch, basically. That is, their meanings cannot be trans epochal, the values themselves are trans epochal. So, therefore, she felt that it was important to have a kind of shared philosophical and ethical understanding that would help these various segments both fight their own causes as well as see if they could come together in a kind of a universalized struggle against oppression and exploitation. And that's what that last essay I put in from her blog attempts to do. How might you do this? You cannot give up one for the other. So you cannot cease fighting as a Dalit just to be part of the working class. Neither can you give up a laborer struggle and just fight against Brahminism. So, but it's also not a simple thing of you do your own fighting, I'll do my own fighting. It's that these fights, of course, have to speak to each other, but somewhere they should also see if there's a common thread that they can hold together. And that for her becomes democracy, and democracy which is beyond the electoral mode, beyond our conventional understanding of the term. Democracy, as Ambedkar himself would sort of had said, as a way of living, as a form of life, as a means to exist fraternally. And so I think Gail picks up on that. And therefore, Dalits and the Democratic Revolution is a kind of a political unpacking of what is this tradition that we can fall back on to enrich our understanding of this guiding thread that can hold us all together. And what is this guiding thread? It is democracy, but understood in this very expansive sense. And so Dalits and the Democratic Revolution does that. It looks at Ambedkar's own life and work. It looks at Dalit movements in central India. And interestingly, what she also does is she places Ambedkar's understanding of the Dalit movements in contrast to the Gandhian resolution and the left resolution. So while granting that Gandhians as well as the left were invested in justice, let's see, if you place them all next to each other, why we may want to give premium to Ambedkar's point of view. So, and I think it's a very interesting exercise that she carries out in Dalits and the Democratic Revolution. And why this is important for women, that's also something she gestures towards. And following that book, she writes this other book called Dalit Visions 90, which is a kind of a pre-Begumpura book. Basically, contains all the themes she would elaborate in Begumpura. And it's the first book which is a kind of a history of ideas. So far, it's been a history of movements, of practices, and as Ananya, as you pointed out, where methodology itself is practice itself is a form of method of understanding society. She's done all of that, but now because she's interested in sort of identifying this thread that will hold these diverse protests together, she wants that also to be viewed in historical cultural terms. It's not only Dalits and the Democratic Revolution and Ambedkar's own practical political work, but the vision that sustained Ambedkar. And that vision, she feels, is a vision that has existed in the subcontinent for quite a while. And that vision sort of indicates what it was in the modern period, right? And then subsequently, she would go on to develop this. Uh, and while the direct references to feminism or to women's movements become less and less in these writings, the themes that she focuses on, the fight against a culture of oppression which sees high and low, the devaluing of labor, the denial of the capacity of ordinary citizens to fight indignity, injustice, and that all of us has that rational, critical capacity to formulate notions of right and wrong. This whole thing that, and I think Ananya, you had pointed out that as well, that people's practices are important and in a central way to understanding how democracy or indeed any value system is kept alive in a society. And I think she wants us to see that not just in the present but in the past as well. So we have a lineage, we have a philosophical tradition, and while socialism tells us some things, there is this tradition which has attended to the specificity of Indian society, which is, of course, shaped by caste, which is shaped by so many other different things, depending on geography, depending on historical variables, and so on. And the peoples of these various geographies have created intellectual, commonplace, collective resources to understand this. So let's see what those resources are. What is that tradition? And of course, she is not the first to have pointed to philosophical traditions of dissent, but until she made this part of the anti caste movement and located it in the lives of ordinary people. Whereas earlier attempts to understand Indian philosophical traditions had remained at the level of philosophical engagement for a progressive cause. Yes, Devi Prasad Chattopadhyay's fantastic work on the Lokayita traditions of early India and so on. And in her own time, Sharad Patil's work, Sharad Patil, who founded the Satyashodak Samaj, and his work with early Buddhist texts and the Puranas to sort of discern a Bahujan Dalit logic in thinking about society. But Gail wants us to see that these are not simply ideas that people held, that were passed on as ideas, but that they fed into how we led our lives. And those lives were led perhaps not at every level in our existence could we challenge every kind of inequality, but certainly some kinds we challenged. And I think she wants us to take note of that. And this is where she makes a case for the bhakti traditions. She doesn't agree with the usual left or even say dismissive thinking on bhakti, that it was a Brahmanical effort to co-opt uh, uh, the sort of insurgent non-Brahmin engagement with personalized devotional traditions. She says that it's too simple a way of looking at things, because while it might appear so in retrospect, at the time that the Bhakti traditions were sort of opening up the world for Dalits and Bahujans and women, they were consequential. You can't sort of, dismiss them as being inconsequential. They had political and social value. And she also draws into her discussion how this panned out in different parts of India, the south and in central India, partially in central India in certain ways. But for northern India, she grants a very important place for Islam. And she makes this very interesting observation about Islam, that while the courts of the emperors and of the kings and the dynasties relied on existing Brahman, Dvija, bureaucratic structures, they sort of didn't downgrade any of these upper castes or their role in governance. But because of the egalitarian core of Islam, and the way Islam was practiced in an everyday sense, it opened up ways of thinking about equality, and which is where she places Kabir. And she points to the importance of Islam in actually catalyzing Bhakti devotionalism in central and parts of southern India. And this is something others have also said, but Gail wants us to see that she's not making a blanket case for Islam, just as she's not making a blanket case for Brahmanism swallowing everything. You know, whether Brahmanism's hegemony or Islam's liberative potential, it has to be seen in its differentiated existence. So it's not the Islam of the courts, it's not the Islam of this shared high culture that she's waxing eloquent about, but the practice of Islam as it affected the lives of people in an everyday sense. And while she's very conscious of the gender dimension, that what it allowed women to do in a public sense, what it didn't do, she also pointed out to the fact women, in a value laden sense, were part of the egalitarian community. In practice, they may not have been. And that in that value laden sense, we have to take that seriously. Whereas, as far as Hinduism was concerned, there was no possibility of a community for women or for the Bahujan Dalits. So, therefore, Bhakti devotionalism becomes the crucible within such a community can actually emerge. So, it may not be permanent, it may be provisional, it may only last during the time of the Varkari pilgrimage to Pandharpur, But nevertheless, it represents something which is in the nature of a revolution in social and cultural terms. Not every revolution has to remake structures. Revolution is also at the level of consciousness, affective, sensibilities, the way you lead the everyday. And this is something she speaks of very beautifully in the introduction to Seeking Begumpura. And why is it such utopianism is important? So that's what she then goes on to do, elaborate these traditions and how important they are, and so on and so forth. And she does that till almost the very end. I mean, one of the last books that she wrote was on Tukaram. And she translated Tukaram's, she and Bharat Patankar translated Tukaram's poems. And Gail has a very long introduction. So, and in your, and I put that, essay in your reading list as well. So I think that whole thing of how have the so-called masses of India spoken back to Brahmanism, spoken against exploitation, uh, that's the burden of her work on the saints of India, on the utopian movements, and so on. Interestingly, she doesn't, of course, stop with the medieval bhakti. She comes into the modern period. She looks at Periyar, Ayotitas, she looks at various others, and so on. So, in effect, she wants us to see there is the rationalist, agnostic, atheistic tradition. There is the devotional tradition. There's a quasi-Islamic tradition, and these to her constitute the bulk of Indian dissenting traditions, whereas the Brahmanic tradition is a minority tradition. It is hegemonic, but it's a minority tradition. Puranic Hinduism is peddled by priests and those that hold positions of power. Now, there is possibility in the Puranas, as she will tell you, the Mahabharata and Ramayana hold many stories that you can retell. But in terms of how they offer guidelines for living in terms of dignity, equality, and justice, she thinks the Bhakti tradition has more to offer. Ethically, the Puranas are extremely ambiguous in many ways. They're fascinating for discussion and debate, but in terms of what is right and wrong, what is just and unjust, the Bhakti tradition to her offers more. So this is how she places that whole literature, and she wants feminists to engage with it on all these grounds, and she feels that that's important, and that's something that will enrich both feminism, of course, but which will also be the kernel for creating a philosophy of liberation that she speaks of in that Begampura essay from her blog, where again she comes back to the women's movement in an interesting way. So, and I think one of the last short pieces she wrote, I think it was for Scroll or Wire, I forget, um, which was like a few years ago, where she again locates the possibilities for change in the way we live our lives in the everyday, in the way you can form non-familial communities based on how these single women have lived, and our relationship to the environment that is balanced and not exploitative. So those themes remain with her as the possibility of an alternative way of living and thinking and so on. So that's what you have in this. That's the for me the way I understand her whole seeking Begampura, pathway that she plots out for herself, and she also equally addresses the anti-caste movement in terms of their gender politics also, but not as emphatically as she addresses the feminists. And I think that's evident in the way she says, if you were to sort of upgrade yourself, immediately you sort of practice a politics of gender subordination. So you exchange mobility in the social order for confining your women at home. This is what her criticism of upwardly mobile Bahujan Dalit social change is all about. She points that out. But she doesn't go beyond that into asking for a gendered agenda to emerge from within their ranks. She also points out why that's something that we need to wait and think about, because these are not even being part of legitimate debating or intellectual spaces yet. She makes that clear in one of her essays, and but yet that's a direction that she would like to see these movements take. Whereas with feminists, she's emphatic and consistent in wanting them to embrace anti-caste thought. With Dalit Bahujans, she wants them to take feminism seriously, but she's also sort of going the slow mode with them, if you want me to use a word, because she feels that the kind of worldviews and politics that they are advancing also need to be addressed with a kind of empathy and critical slowness. So this is how she sort of places her whole agenda, the last of her writings. And here I just want to end by pointing to her really interesting book on Buddhism. Um, and some of it is, of course, there in that review essay of Kancha Ailaya's book, where she points to, and I think Jay had also marked that out in his response note, that she does not quite agree with Ailaya on some things, or with those who take another position. Ailaya sees the Buddhist Sangha as a very ideal organization, whereas others see Buddhism in a more personally emancipatory manner. Gail agrees, sort of steers a third position. She does not go with either of those positions. She sees the Buddha as a very nuanced thinker, and who sort of adapts his worldview to different constituencies and different concerns that emerge in the course of his dialogue with people. And so she sees the Buddha's message as holding out different possibilities which are held together by his overall philosophical framework. That's what you have in that review essay, and she elaborates on that in a historical sense in the book on the Buddha. But I think what is very interesting is her philosophical engagement with Buddhism, um, apart from the ethical engagement, which for her is very important. But this whole thing of, and I'm really going to be very, very crude here because I don't know enough, and I'm only taking my arguments from Gail, is this very complex notion of what the Buddhist philosophers call dependent co-origination. Why does anything happen the way it does? And there are multiple causes, and each cause has multiple causes, and they all come together to produce something at the moment, and that something is constantly changing. So basically there is this notion of radical impermanence in Buddhist philosophical thought. One of you here is well versed with philosophy, you can put it better than I perhaps can. But basically, the idea of radical impermanence. Therefore, what that means is, and this is what she examines in her blog essay, if nothing is certain and eternal, but what is certain and eternal is what she says is the human capacity to constantly think and renew our understanding of the world. That is something that we've always done. And there she quotes from Marx. That's the essay starts with a quote from Marx, right? So that human capacity to constantly think through situations, to gain a critical handle on the world, that is a something that is we've done always. So you can rely on that, but everything else is impermanent and everything else is historical. So so this capacity to think and critically engage, it has to reckon with the fact of impermanence, but it has to reckon with it in a radical sort of way. And what does that mean? I think that's what she picks up from Buddhism. And there the whole Buddha's whole stress on mindfulness and a compassionate relationship to the world becomes very important for her. And it is really the relationship you forge with living beings in your world, in a collective sense, in a political sense, in a mindful way, keeping in focus that we all need to build a kinder, more compassionate, and equal world. That is what will militate against our despair over impermanence, right? And this is something that she also picks up from Ambedkar, the Buddha and his Dhamma, where Ambedkar very emphatically sort of lists all the worthy values advanced by the Buddha. And he argue, and he, in a very telling statement, he says that um, while wisdom or enlightenment or clarity is important, prajna is very important. A prajna that is unleavened by shield can turn very dangerous. He calls it a double-edged sword. Knowledge without shield can become a double-edged sword because you can turn it against the world. You can also turn it in favor of the world. And what will decide what you do is really is how you behave, what you are in practice, in other words, right? So this philosophical thing cannot be solved by philosophy, right? It can only be solved by the way you actually live, and then that becomes the basis for you to understand the world. So it's a kind of a loop that you keep going back and forth, and that loop is what characterizes Gail's own work. She goes out, she comes back, she goes out, she comes back, and she does that in a way that, as she says, popular readers, so that even it appeals to a popular readership, by which she means the engaged reader, not the reader for whom things have to be simplified to the point where they cease to mean anything. So her book on Buddhism, therefore, is very interesting because I think it sort of you see her pulling many things together, and for her, the Buddha is, of course, at the head of this dissenting tradition that she writes about. The Buddha is the one who starts off this journey towards Begumpura. Uh, and so that's where we are with Gail. And I think what I have learned both by reading her over the years, but also especially in terms of preparing for this course, was to sort of see how her vision of the greater common good emerged from her being a feminist, and how her being a feminist made her a very unusual thinker when it came to matters such as a social totality. you know and the social totality, at least in the Indian context, has been largely taught through by men. Leftist readers, leftist thinkers very rarely have feminist insights shape their understanding of the social totality, or the social totality itself has not been rethought from a feminist lens. So I think Gail therefore does that through much of her life. And in the Indian context, for her, rethinking it from a feminist perspective has meant that you also rethink it from the point of view of the most marginal. And the most marginal for her, all these women without familial locations, women who are outside the bond of kinship and family, and who are almost, in her own experience, inevitably Dalit Bahujan women. So it is from that space that she thinks. And thinking from that space makes her think of not a vanguard that would transform things, but of various segments that ought to be held together. Because as she points out very clearly, and in that blog essay, Ambedkar's dream of Dalits acquiring power is impossible in a electoral democracy, because you will always need to align with others. So what will be the basis of that alliance? So you need that democratic thread there. The most marginal cannot hope to fight on their own. If they have to align with a movement or a party, what will guarantee that their voices remain central to what defines justice? Again, you need that thread. Whether it's the farmers' movement wanting to create sustainable agro worlds, drawing from modern biotechnology, drawing from informatics, and all of that. Again, what will sustain any sense of equality in that world, because it's already driven by caste, if not class. So again, you need that thread. And in the ecological movement, your connection to the natural world. You also have to have a sense of your connection with each other, because that alone will sustain your connection with the natural world, right? So you see her therefore doing all of that, and I realized this while I was putting this course together, what an amazing journey it is in terms of how she took herself along on this journey, and now of course her readers, many of us along, and all of this was done with a very uh, disarming kind of intellectual engagement, there is no attempt to beguile the reader, dazzle the reader, no heavy theory, though it is full of rich concepts. There is no, she is absolutely disinterested in railing against the West, or in sort of railing against Brahmanism just for the sake of railing against it. But basically, to say that railing against Brahmanism is a lifelong business and you must take it seriously. It can't simply be an ideological weapon. So I think in all these ways, you see her as giving us, in these really bleak times, as giving us something to think about carefully, something to learn from. And as feminists, I think returns us to some very fundamental things of our lives that sometimes do not appear as central to us, but which I think this past year has shown so much, the unrelenting labor of women. I mean, so many people stuck at home, having to work double time, whether middle class, upper class, or whatever. The labor of care, with so much mortality and death on our hands over these last 18 months. And I think that centrality of how the world should really be in such a way that these lives are valued. And along with the labor of women, the labor of the workers, most of whom are Dalits and lower caste Bahujans. So I think she has made us take these not simply as political categories for mobilization, but also as worlds from which you need to draw civilizational sustenance. And then also work towards creating structures of equality that would help this. And I think, given the extremely hate-filled and violent times we are living in, this whole question of what is our civilization is also a fundamental question we need to keep asking. And she shows us a way of thinking about it, which requires us to do practical work, but also makes us not despair, because this is a very old problem, as she reminds us, going back to the time of the Buddha, and it acquires some extremely vicious forms, as it has done throughout history. I'm sure people who lived during the Peshwa regime in Maharashtra must have felt as terrible as we are doing now, or at other regimes in other parts of India. So I think Gail makes us see these as part of the long durée, but also as something you can't run away from, therefore. You can't say this is a system and run away from it, or wait for a revolutionary movement, but understand, see what you can do by way of thought, pay attention to what's happening in people's own attempts to better their lives, and see how you bring them together. And I think I leave you with those broad arguments, and I do hope you go on to read her other writings and over a period of time, and thanks for being here. And though we started out with a large number of students, some of you have stayed faithfully, and so thanks, and thanks a lot to Kushal and Rupali for putting this together, and making sure everything worked. And to Deepa for letting us use her films. I would like to sort of just point to that one film that I hope you all saw, the one on Basavanna from Young Historians, which is one of my absolute favorites from Deepa's oeuvre, because it really captures what Gail wants us to notice about Begumpura. You know, it is alive. Begumpura is not a land that is always somewhere else. In the voices of those children, in the way in the teacher and that student community respond, and in the way the film itself unfolds. It's a gentle moment. It's not something stentorian, but it's also a reminder that there is so much wisdom in everyday lives. And I think that film, therefore, for me, speaks to me a lot. I've seen it like hundreds of times, but it always makes me sort of sit back and feel that there is still so much hope that one needs to hold on to. So thank you.
Your video is off,
Yeah,
Dr.
yeah,
Deepa.
it's coming
Okay.
back. My
Okay, okay,
current
okay.
went off for a minute. I had to. Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
it's back. It's back.
Okay. Um, I mean, it's a delight to hear you. I mean, there were many moments when I was actually having goosebumps when you were, you know, bringing all these readings together and trying to show us, trying to yourself see in a different light, and then also making us see all these readings in a different light. Maybe we can take a break for 3 to 4 minutes and
Yeah,
then
yeah,
get back
yeah.
together.
I just want to start the thing with a few remarks from Ranjana because she's
Okay.
actually known. So, Ranjana, after the short break, if you can speak for a few minutes, that'll be nice.
Okay.
So, see
Thank
you in
you.
5 minutes.
Yes. Is everyone there? Mm,
I think
Yeah,
so. Yeah.
okay, great.
I think so. Everybody here? Yeah. So I just want to very briefly introduce Ranjana. Ranjana is an old friend and comrade from the women's movement. She was very active in Saili in Delhi. But apart from that, she's also been consistently engaged with struggles on the ground. And one of her most, she's the author of two very important books. One is she wrote a few years ago, which I think is a uh, very, very sort of telling work in terms of what we witness in the country today, the farmers' movement. This book is titled Those Who Did Not Die. It's about the wives of all the farmers who committed suicide in the Punjab. And she worked closely with Kisan organizations and with any number of unions there to write this book. This was some years ago. More recently, she's got a book out along with Nigamananda Sadangi called Resisting Dispossession, the Odia story, the story from Odisha, which looks at a slew of movements against different kinds of dispossession, starting from the struggle against the Hirakud project in the 1940s, down until the struggle against POSCO and various other things, the Niyamgiri struggle and everything in Odisha today. And her analysis spans a range of contexts: Dalit, Bahujan, peasants, fishers, and so on. So, and while talking about Gail, she was saying how in the past she had visited Kasegaon a couple of times and she's engaged with the farm peasant movement also in her own work. So I just thought it'll be nice to hear from Ranjana a few words before we open up and have discussions. So rarely do we know people who've engaged with Gail in that sense, at least here. So Ranjana, thanks.
Yes. Good evening, everybody. Should I put on the
Yeah, yeah,
camera?
put on.
I'm not prepared for this, but I can share a bit. Thanks so much, Geeta. I didn't, and for the introduction also. I'm feeling a bit embarrassed. I think Geeta really covered much ground, and I'm so glad I was able to sneak into this meeting. And I feel sad also why some people have dropped out when there are people like me and Deepa attending it. And the reason for me sneaking in, and I really thank all of you, the department, for giving, allowing it to happen also, it's because of the troubled times that we are in, and engagement with the set of discussions and the kind way, the incredible way in which only Geeta can do it, the way she's put in articles, films, and everything together, literature, and been able to draw it so well in over 3 sessions. I think it's a very rare opportunity. And yeah, it is recorded, but I think the real thing is about meeting here and now. It's also kind of a meditative engagement because of the kind of rising misogyny that we are in. We'll talk about Hindutva and capitalism with the way it's happening, but as a feminist, to be able to go through a chief justice getting away with allegations against him, through the rapists and Hathras getting away. The protection of the rapists has become a big signifier of the times. And to unravel it, we just have to look at privileges, we have to look at land, we have to look at caste. And in a way, I think it comes from the reason of being dissatisfied also, despite being a so-called liberated woman, is because of the times that we belong to, of people like Gail around and many other people also. There were no women's studies that time, so all writings that were done by Gail were political writings. Gail and others. There was nothing to differentiate that this is academic or not academic. There were just pamphlets, leaflets, and political writings. An article in the APW was far more political than anything else. So I'll just touch upon a couple of points. The difference that I had passed out from Indraprastha College in Delhi, and I've spent over 35 years in Delhi. I'm in Orissa now, where I belong. But I grew up with the rise of the emergence of the autonomous women's movement. I think Geeta and me roughly would be the second generation in it. But it was very important to, you're aware of personal is political, and to fight against wife beating and counseling, giving support to women, short stay homes, dealing with battered women, and at the same time looking at sati and sex determination tests that were coming in a big way, population control policies, which you saw in Deepa's wonderful film, Something Like a War. Uh, Despite working almost, I was a whole timer for all those years, but the connection with mass struggles and mass resistance was what was missing and is still missing. It's just Gita's grace and maturity that she's put it so well that we didn't have the organizing ability, but there's fundamentally something missing in it. So when so well, Deepa, really, I got to see Nipani and Pune domestic workers, because we have used it all the time as examples, but to see it visually made a huge difference to me. After the first session, I was almost numbed for some time because I saw a face to those women. So when the domestic worker is caught between an alcoholic husband on one side and a very aggressive, demanding middle class malkin on the other side, that's the pulse of patriarchy, and that's the pulse that I think I understood without waiting for the second session for Gita to say why she brought in those films. That those are the politics of that Gail was espousing also, and I think she always felt that nothing is enough until women from the Bahujan, Dalit Bahujan majority join in. And another thing that was very different from the identity politics of today is that we articulated, saw these, and we were influenced by many people other than Gail also as the baggage of a largely Hindu society that thrives on male preference, that thrives on sex determination test, that has sanction for everything, that has many ways of removing women from the womb, to Banaras Ghat, to widow burning, to Dain Hatya jisko kehte hain, witch hunting. So all that was making sense, and what Gail did, and I had the opportunity, I was like a toddler, perhaps I in the preparation of the Patna Women's Movement Conference. So the Women's Movement Conference the Women's Movement had many conferences, and the third was in 1988 in Patna, the first and the second, 80 and 83. I think I was in college at that time, but it was in Mumbai. All this history is available. But Patna was a huge, it really opened ground and the canvas of what we understood, what we are up against. And Gail had a very crucial role to play in it with all her humbleness and modesty. None of us knew who was working, who was not. But as personally being involved in the preparation of that conference, I can say that Gail's role was phenomenal. A lot of things had happened between the second and the third conference also, like Shah Bano's case had come up where the Muslim women were denied maintenance. Roop Convert Sati had taken place in Rajasthan. Population control policies were coming in a very big way. And the Ministry of Women was with sports at that time. It was women's sports and youth, was a ministry. So a lot of pressure took place to create a ministry separately for women. So that time we named the Women's Movement Conference Nari Mukti Sangharsh Sammelan, which means women's liberation, nothing short of women's liberation. And how there was already beginning of talk. I wonder, Gita, why till today there is so much of disowning of it or debate about it, that how from struggle the path was going on to development work, and will development really liberate women? It had already come up in the Patna conference. It came up in a big way later in the Calicut conference. So that time in those preparatory meetings, I hope I don't take up too much time, the kind of questions that we had were not about logistics. Now it is understood that someone will write the leaflet and somebody will put 5 points and we reply on email, or whatever. Email is still more recent. But that we know what the conference is about, and the logistics is the discussion, and how to raise the money and to book an auditorium. But all those happened by the way, like after our political mission is clear what we are together doing. We used to debate everything literally, and it's understood that we were so committed and so invested in the process कि the table, chair, auditorium, ticket booking, सब कुछ अपने आप ही हो जाएगा. So in this, some of the kind of debates, I can recall 2 or 3 that, like, do we need creches, or do we need to remove sexual division of labor, or should we keep up the demand of sexual division of labor even if we have creches for all children in the urban cities? But this of bringing change from within, whether to influence the bureaucracy and the ministry to become part of it, as it got to be called in later years third wave of feminism in the West, or to have your charter of demands when elections come and be with every party and call party representatives and ask them to answer. And who are the domestic workers? What is difference between me washing the dishes and saying, "Okay, I'm leading my life without a domestic worker," or I'm just very nice to her and I pay her more and I give her some discipline? Or where do they come from? What's the caste background they come from? These are questions that made that really had no answers and kept our focus going, at least. And there were few people who were organizing domestic workers, but the bills and all that came up later was nothing compared to the struggles that were in Pune. So today I feel that while working with Gail, and I also had the privilege of having a holiday with her, because a friend who knows both of us landed up in calling me to Jharkhand, and I landed up and Gail was staying in the same house. So we got, I was still a chutku, but we analyzed the conference we were coming from, and that paved the way for a friendship also, because I felt, yes, I'm metro, I'm urban, but obviously it's not my feminism I'm fighting for. So it's a generation whose politics were invested, whether something happened in Brazil or in China, something happened in Kerala, or in some slum in Delhi or Mumbai also. It would be like it would be everybody's cause. It's not like something that is happening there, and who are we or who am I, who will represent, who to happen much later. And that's how patriarchy is worth playing out. And today I wonder how Gail would have been. The last few years she has not been fine. She had not been fine. And before that, in the mid 90s or late 90s, there was a bit of a difference, because when I was seeing Delhi fall apart with the large exodus of working class population and demolition of bastis by MC Mehta's petition and all that stuff, there was a line that they took on the new economic policies that made me feel a bit cold. And we've written letters also. In fact, there are some handwritten letters also. I don't know where they are. And there are handwritten notes also that Gail would write to a set of friends, and I happen to be one of them. So today, like, I think, I don't know, but like what Gail is saying is coming true in a very big way, whether it is the lakhs of government workers in Bangalore saying no to a 8,000 rupees salary and they want a minimum wage of over 11,000 rupees, or the plantation workers of Munnar, Shaheen Bagh, or Punjab. I feel that women are resisting in mass numbers. And for all of us who believe in feminism, it's for us to figure out where we stand vis-a-vis those struggles. There's nothing short of that. You have to address the political economy to the extent that it's not only farmers committing suicide that led me to Punjab, but today self-help groups are the biggest binding factor for women to come together with women. They have to yield, they have to recover loans also. A group of women, one person has to be attacked by seven other people in the group to recover whole loan, otherwise the group loses its loan, leading to deaths of women who are in self-help groups when the recovery agents come. So there have been women in Punjab who are committing suicide as the time comes for loan, or taking multiple loans. There are still two differences. I will just end here, because Gail has really given a lifetime of praxis and reading also. In fact, this was an opportunity for me to go over her journey and her readings, and Geeta really put it in such a brilliant way, the way she has structured it. That questioning the family, questioning domestic violence, sexual division of labor, male preference, we are like really a thorn in the face of any socialist or left alliance. We are left, we are Marxists, and it's not the legacy of male leftists only. Marx is not the legacy of male leftists only, but we see common cause as long as these are addressed. And Gail gave a grounding to it, to look at how the operations of religion and caste works, and how capitalism works. And I think finding ourselves somewhere in between these two would definitely help us and take this session a bit further also. Thanks.
Thanks, Ranjana. Thanks so much. Because I just felt that it was important to also communicate that all this is part of a collective continuum. Gail's work, the work that some of us have put in the women's movement, and in some ways, our conversation with the women here also. They're all part of a continuum, and with men who are invested in democratic and anti-caste politics. So I think in that sense, it's a very important thing to have as many voices speak about these things from a situation where we worked with women like Gail, and thanks for that. Which is why I'm sorry I sort of brought it about on you suddenly. But I thought since you've been here for all three classes, it would be good for everybody to hear you a little bit. And I do recommend Anjana's book, Resisting Dispossession, the Odisha Story, because I think it's in some ways it captures the richness of all that Gail alerts us to when we look at people's movements. What do the people themselves say? How do they understand? How do they theorize? And she's given us such a long historical view from the 1940s to the 2000s. So it's published by Akar Books, Resisting Disposition, the Odisha Story. And it's also a very nice read, apart from saying whatever it does. Lots of songs and stories and many other
I'll
things in the
I'll
book.
send it on the mail. I'll
Yeah, please do. So now it's open to all of you. I think I have said enough. And um, yes, yes, Priya.
Thank you so much, both Dr. Geeta and Ranjana ji. There's so much to say, and I think given it's a small group, I think it gives us a little bit more time. I really hope that there were more people, but still, I will not take a lot of time. I'll start with what Ranjana ji just said about self-help groups and women committing suicide. So that is something which we also saw during the migrant crisis last year when the lockdown had just been imposed, and there were these migrant workers stuck, and we were sending them back. Then after they were back to their villages and we were trying to rehabilitate them, one of the things that I was not at all aware about this thing, that a lot of women who are under loan in through their self-help groups, and there were loan sharks coming there. So this then it kind of reminded me of that, and then I can compare it with what I had written in my last response to last time's readings, wherein taking from Gail Longwith's that paper on family and liberalization, where she has said that we have to look at women not just as consumers but as producers, and she had mentioned about government schemes and what we can, and sustainable agriculture. So there in that response, I had mentioned about my own village where under livelihood mission, women are getting more confident, and they're producing their own things and getting their money. But I couldn't think of this, which I can now remember after listening to Rachana ji, that what other thing is also happening. It's not just about a very positive impact on women with self-help groups and these livelihood missions, but what is also happening in the self-help groups in terms of this loan, these negative impacts of that, which kind of takes me to what I think that Gail Omwit has been doing through her writings, wherein she of course has put great emphasis on the fact that we have to relook at the history, be it of colonialism or national struggle. She makes a very straight distinction between a nationalist struggle, and a social revolution, which was happening, wherein she talks about the caste movements and other things. But I think one of the things that I kind of saw throughout her work was that she, of course, she presents an ideal that we have to talk about the most marginalized women and low caste people, but she also kind of somewhere knows that what are the fault lines there. For example, in her reinventing revolution, towards the end, she talks about this Bhil leader, but then she also says that talking about tribals and giving them space and not always talking for them, but talking with them, giving them also the space to speak. So she does recognize these factors, that not everything is kind of really positive, but something which I think I found in all her writings towards the end is finding some resolution. So, for example, if she talks about, if she reviews Brahminical rewriting history by Uma Chakrabarti and talks about Brahminical patriarchy, towards the end, she also talks about what might be the slightest positive thing that colonialism did was to give education to women, through which they started then writing about their own things and reading, beat Pandita Ramabai or other women that she was talking about. Then again, she does a very similar thing, for example, in the review of Kanchai Laya's book on Buddha, towards the end of which she kind of, she says that Sangha was one idealist place, but then Buddha was also looking at, and that's where she quotes Ambedkar towards the end. That Dr. Geeta also said that, but looking at Buddha as someone who also looked at the social structure and who also was open to understanding when somebody reasoned with him that, okay, why women are not being allowed in Sangha, and then that entire dialogue that she's put from Kanchai Laya's book there, towards the end of it, then she again says that, okay, we know that there are some issues, but towards the end of it, what do we want? Do we want a semi-feudal casteist kind of regime, or can we look at alternative in the democratic capitalism? And very similar things she's done throughout, where she has questioned people who have been questioning liberalization, who have been questioning, opening of markets. But she says that, can we see something positive also here? Can we look at it as something, giving more opportunities to the underprivileged? So that is something which I think that, that was also one of the threads that I found throughout her work, that she is raising questions where she talks about different movements, but she is also trying to then come towards the end to some resolution. That, she is trying to see that there is hope, and the hope will only come true when we recognize the realities that we have to take women's question into account, and we have to take the question of the caste into account. And it very well related to all the films that you had suggested. And young historians is something, if even if the people say that Bhakti movement was under, it was, say, the upper caste who had just, it was just farce. But when we look at young historians, that one very nice film, which also talks a lot about how pedagogy should be, with with children, how these things should be taught. So there, actually, the entire story about 13th century and Bangla, I think that was again something which is something with each film we could relate to, be it the question of domestic workers, the question of Nipani workers, what, and I think one of the questions which she's continuously looking at is labor question of women, and she has been kind of time and again coming back to that. So I think connecting all the films together, that was also a very crucial point. And the last point I'll say is that she has also made this distinction, I think it was in Phule's paper, between functionalist view and the conflict view, that the elite always looks at the society through a functionalist view, that everything is as is because that's how the society is functioning with consensus. So caste system is because of so the society functions nicely. But then she kind of points the conflict view, and that we see in the 13th century with young historians example, that we see in Phule's work in his time, that we see through Ambedkar's writing, that we see through her examples of Hindutva building that time when it was slowly building up, and that we see today. So it kind of something related to what Dr. Geeta said, that we despair a lot about what is happening today. But these kind of historical examples tell us that these things have been happening, and there have been counter to these things. It's just about how do we keep going ahead, and that is what I take from Gail Omved's work, finding resolution. I think that's what I saw towards the end of each of her essays, and I'll definitely go back and read more of her work and maybe write something someday. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Priyanka. Thanks, Priya. I'm glad that you actually managed to read Reinventing Revolution. and yeah, great.
Ananya, would you like to respond based on your paper, or would you like to say something? Bhakti, Jay, anyone?
Bhakti is put up. Yes, Bhakti. Yes, Bhakti.
Bhakti, you're on mute.
You're on mute.
Yes. Can you hear
Oh,
me
yeah.
now?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. I mean, I think like everybody else, I'm just going to take this opportunity first to thank you, Professor Geeta, for this enlightening workshop. It was a really great learning experience to be exposed to the wealth of writings by Gail Omved. She clearly covered a lot of ground, not only empirically, but also in terms of different theoretical traditions, and uh, using different analytical lenses, be it gender or class or caste. And I think it was this workshop was also a training for our students in methods and using different sources. You rightly pointed out in one of your speeches that Gail used a lot of different sources, ranging from the marriage ads in vernacular newspapers, as well as films and conferences. So there was a great variety in sources, and I think it was not only Gail but also you who made sure that we got to know her through different sources, be it films or her book reviews or opinion pieces or original articles, full length academic essays. So there was a great variety there. So thank you very much for that. What I personally what struck me personally the most was, again, something that you had pointed out in one of your speeches, that she always maintained this dignified tone of the debate. So she always, the way she the way she made different theoretical traditions, be it traditional Marxists, or as she called it, non-traditional Marxists, and feminist and anti-caste, to speak to each other, and she pointed out their contradictions, but in the same breath, she always recognized their contribution. So here I can only second Priya in saying that she always ended on the note where she recognized their contribution and charted a way forward. And this actually leaves me wondering, um, to know how was her critique responded to. So was, you alluded to this in some of your speeches, so I'm just curious to know how her critique was responded by some of those who were at the receiving end of a criticism, and what were the main grounds of criticism. So if you could say a bit more on that, that I would be very grateful. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to share a very charming line that she wrote before I went on go on to this. This when she translated Tukaram, and she sort of writes, and it's there in that essay. If you remember, she compares them to this wonderful tradition of what is known as Negro spirituals, the wonderful music coming from the African American plantation slavery days. And you see how she carries with her that sense of, whatever it is that opened up the world for her generation in the United States. And that she would actually see these in the same tradition, for me, was a very poignant and beautiful kind of comparison. And talking of sources, what really makes anyone's worldview is a very interesting question. Music. And she has a very lovely piece on Dalit music, actually, which I will try and send. I will send Ananya. I mean, I'll send it to the group. You'll be able to access it. A short piece, but basically she's translated all the early songs of these movements. And then for the Bulletin of Concerned Asian Scholars, she continuously translated the poetry that came out of the Dalit Panther movement from very, very early on. She was one of the earliest translators, along with Eleanor Elliott, of this poetry. So anyway, so Gail, for her, literature was important, and poetry was important, and I think she didn't have time to do everything all the time. But talking of sources, it's an interesting way to think of people's consciousness also. What shapes a consciousness, not just debates and ideas, but many other things as well. Now, coming to how people received her criticism, see, this is also interesting. In the pages of the EPW, there are lots of back and forth things you can see. If you go back to that time, you'll see, especially on the whole farmers movement, there was a lot of disagreement on her suggestion that you don't see farmers only in class terms. You also have to see how the entire agricultural sector is subsidizing Indian, food distribution and Indian industry and so on. So clearly, there were a lot of people on the left who didn't take kindly to that, and there was a lot of back and forth on, can you afford to see the agrarian economy as a single whole? What about class differences? And most of these exchanges were civil. But in some cases, I think there's a way in which Marxism also functions like a high church, no? I mean, it sort of hands out these really sort of lofty theoretical arguments, which Gail, I think, in a couple of places loses her cool. And I didn't put those articles in because she said them in other places also. Basically, she takes on the international diasporic South Asian left. I think she has greater patience for the local left because they are people in struggle. But when theorists were sitting elsewhere and making these pronouncements, I think she gets very annoyed. And she does take them on in a fairly severe fashion. You see that in Bulletin, you see that in Journal of Asia. These are places that she was writing in. But she's, as you said, extremely civil most of the time. And people who responded to her are equally civil because, I mean, she is civil, so you can't be uncivil to her. You can be tough in your criticism, but you can't be uncivil. But I think that the great sadness, what I think, is that there's been very little engagement with her anti-caste writings or with the challenges that she posed the left when it came to caste. I think that challenge was not taken up at all in a serious fashion, except in one instance in the 1970s when she was still sort of in the early years of her work, but all these ideas were already there as part of her universe. She had a long and sustained dialogue with B.T. Ranadive of the CPM. in the pages of social scientists, which is again a very interesting thing to look at. So Dhanadeve was tough, but he was also he was willing to give Gail a hearing, which cannot be said of subsequent communist leaders. But he did listen to her. She also wrote for Frontier, which was actually, people will remember that Frontier identified itself with the far left, with Marxism, Marxist-Leninist groups, with the Naxals, critically aligned. But Gail wrote for them, and she sort of also, I think some of them disagreed with her, but there was all of that. But I think agreement, disagreement apart, there was little engagement with the things she was saying about caste and gender. And I think that is something that we need to keep in mind. And from within the feminist circle, also, very little engagement was there with the bulk of her feminist writings. There wasn't much engagement, but also I think part of the reason is that Gail was not seen as a feminist thinker at all, which is, I think, to my eternal sadness, because I mean, a feminist thinker does not only think about women's concerns. A feminist thinker thinks from within feminism about the rest of the world, and Gail was that precisely. Really, that was her ground. And as Ranjana was saying, it is those women's lives and those women's voices, and the fact that women are seldom seen as theorists, all of which really Gail takes apart in a very disarming way. So, and I feel lack of engagement is also uncivil, no, in some ways. So, and in India, it's the most prevalent form of incivility. In some, by ignoring something, you want to make it go away. So, yeah.
Thank you very much.
I think, I mean, is anybody wants to speak? Okay, so I will take the liberty to add some points. Actually, I do agree with you that, I mean, she has not been engaged with enough, and I think it is part of, even, I don't know, it's part of, I don't know, a kind of a legacy that I think a leftist, even academicians, have practiced against. I think even anti-caste, I think thinkers before Umved. I think she carries the legacy of Mahatma Phule and Ambedkar. But I think for many years, even Ambedkar was not engaged with. He was actually an untouchable, who was untouchable scholar in certain ways, because his work was not engaged with enough. I think even Pule, to that matter, for really long. I mean, Pule has a major contribution in the social reform movement, because, as you rightly, I mean, mentioned, that, I mean, the amount of work that he did on women's questions during his time. I mean, it was really extraordinary, considering what other social reformers in Maharashtra were doing. I mean, they were in some ways hypocrites, for taking ahead the widow remarriage question, but not actually marrying widows, or when it came upon them, or their family members, they were not practicing what they preached. But Fule was completely on the other end, and to that matter, and Omved puts it very nicely, the way she makes this demarcation between why Fule is a revolutionary and others are actually reformers, because he was saying entirely different things, beyond his time. And then, I mean, she puts it really nicely. And I also read Rosalind O'Hanlon's work on Fule, and I can see how different these two scholars speak about one thinker, I would say, where Hanlon again and again says that, okay, Fulle did not critique Britishers for their policies, whereas, and he in some ways supported Britishers, or was, closer to them, and that is why he was critiqued by the then social reformers, by his colleagues. But uh, this Umbe does not say it like that. I mean, even the way she says it, it's entirely different. She says that, I mean, Phule is a person who deserves the woman's respect. I remember that sentence in the article that you shared. That, I mean, he's one of the philosophers who deserves a woman's respect. And I think the way she puts all these thinkers, all these activists who were working at that time, who were actually not looked at. I think she looks at them, and in some ways, is that a reason that why she's not engaged with? I'm trying to understand. I mean, because I have read her work recently before her death, because I'm trying to write a paper on Phule. So I mean, why do you think this lacuna exists? Could you, I mean,
Yeah.
shed some light on it, maybe? Um,
Let's, I think one of the, and it's very interesting because many of you have also said you didn't have a chance to read her in your coursework. And Kushal also said that the richness of her work didn't sort of appear as evident some years ago when it came to recruiting people in Pune. I think there are two or three ways in which we can understand it. One is, of course, that I always say this in all my classes that history is always ahead of us, right? I mean, we are always, like Hegel said, we are like Minerva's owl. We theorize only after it's done. And basically, I think Gail or Periyar or Ambedkar have been constantly signaled and spoken about in all vernacular intellectual traditions, wherever they belong, whether it's Maharashtra or Tamil Nadu or other parts of India. And to and I think it's that sort of owning up to these thinkers as thinkers somewhere did not transit to our formal academic or intellectual traditions, in spite of a lot of work being published, in spite of the fact Ambedkar wrote almost all much of his major work in English. And at least for Fulle, you can say translations were not available. But with Ambedkar, there's no such, everything was in English basically. And at least by the 90s, all his collected works were available. Until then, some volumes were available. So there's no excuse for saying that you can't access him. He was very accessible. He was around, and books were around. But why has it taken the formal intellectual worlds and the formal academic systems to reckon with these important figures? It's not that society has forgotten them. Even now, there are thousands of books on Periyar or Ambedkar in Tamil and in Marathi, and every year there are events, there are whatever, and so on. So there is such a division of intellectual labor. No, what comes from within vernacular life worlds or traditions is simply not reflected in the way we do intellectual work in our universities or elsewhere. So I think there's something to be said about how do you link vernacular thought worlds to what transpires in universities. And I think Sharmila Rege has done an amazing amount of work on both in practical terms and in theoretical terms. Some of her earliest writings on her critiques of sociology as a discipline came from this. That there's people keep saying that sociology standards have fallen because Mofussil universities are taking over, and then she says, but what are we saying? We are really not looking at the possibilities of what happens when a new generation of students come in who don't speak English, but who bring with them an entire gamut of life experiences, and who come from contexts where other things have happened. So, how do we rethink that connection between the vernacular and the formal teaching of a discipline? I think she was one of the first few to raise that question. And subsequently, many others have been raising it. I mean, Satish Deshpande has raised it in terms of how do you teach. I mean, from a largely pedagogy point of view, I mean. Now, as to why we don't see them as part of our thinking worlds, I mean, Gail's work was out in 74, and it was published by a local press, the social scientists. It was published by activist intellectuals in Maharashtra, the book. It was not published by any of the commercial presses. And that's important to recognize as well. So it was available in Maharashtra. So Maharashtrians obviously read it to an extent at least. So clearly, I think there's that vernacular thing with the English thing one needs to think about. Secondly, I think there has been a tendency on the part of progressive academia across, especially in universities that set the intellectual precedents, whether it's JNU or whether it's some other universities. Let's say Calcutta University or whatever, depending on how you understand how precedents were set, which marked the boundaries of worthwhile progressive thought. And I think if you look at only the practice of those universities, you see that they have played a big role in defining what is worthy of study and what's not worthy of study. And I think somewhere regional universities, as they are often sort of referred to in a disparaging sense, you know, they have been also pressured to sort of keep up with those standards. But I think in Maharashtra, especially, that has not always been the case. I don't know about the central institutes, but I do know a lot of very rich work was done in all the regional universities. Shivaji University in Kolhapur itself is an example of, and Pune, of course, so much work has been done in Pune, in Savitribai Phule University today. So I think that particularly your generation has been the heavy recipient of a tradition that is identified solely with the progressive left and the centralized universities. And I think whatever has happened in the regions has not been taken into account at all in a very important way. And Sharmila Rege or Gail Lomith remain Maharashtrian thinkers, whereas they are not. For us, they are thinkers that speak to all of us. Right? But I think that has never been the. Whereas you have to write from within Delhi or Kolkata or some other place, you become a national thinker. So it's also the politics of nationalism in some ways, which even our most progressive institutions have not been entirely able to reckon with. I mean, I think one of the books that emerged that made a pathbreaking sort of intervention with the writing of history was we were also making history from Telangana, but it never received the salience that it should, except in the women's movement. Nationalist historiography didn't think it important to rethink its understanding of many issues, or even communist historiography for that matter. So I think it's also that politics at work somewhere that has happened. But also I think from the beginning, caste has been the study of two kinds of critical trajectories. One is, or three rather, one is caste has been studied by government. The British ethnographers, all sociology students know that very well, who studied caste. Administrators, scholars from Risley, from this one, that one, you know the entire lot. Then caste has been studied by academic writers from that period. I mean, after all, Gurye and others were part of the colonial system of education. That entire tradition of Indian scholars who studied caste. But parallel to this were people who were active in fighting caste who studied caste. Ambedkar being the foremost amongst them. So, why is it that we decided when we teach sociology that this was not important, but only the official studies of caste and the academic studies of caste were important? What led to that choice? Gurria himself is guilty of having set a syllabus in place that perhaps achieved some of this. And also, why is M. N. Srinivas as important, but not Maithili Sivaraman, who studied the rumblings of class and caste struggle in Tanjavur? See, his whole thing of Sanskritization comes from there, from observing a South Indian village. And it's not any South Indian village, it's in the Delta region. It's a particular kind of Brahmanical village structure. You can't even extrapolate from it to the rest of Tamil Nadu, right? But no one tells you that. It becomes a theory. But at the same time that Srinivas was studying that village, that entire society was being rocked by left struggles, by struggles against caste. So ideally, we should be looking at both. The Sanskritation thesis was being advanced from within a geography that had seen consistent anti-Brahmanical and class struggles. So I think those are also, I think we tend to sort of privilege the textual word over word that comes from more hybrid and contaminated sources. We are very afraid of places where we feel there is bias, where we feel there's partisanship, um, and so on. But even in pedagogical terms, it would make sense, apart from political terms, to look at five different views of the same thing. No, but somewhere we have not done that. This is my understanding, but I've never been in academia long enough to understand how all of this works. In fact, I've never been in academia, so that's something I share with Gail. We both always been outside the academy. So
Thank you for putting that so well. I mean, you have not been part of academia, but I think that is you are thinking like that. But for us, you are very much an academician, and there should this distinction of academician and activist. I think we have to break.
no, of course, we have to break it. But the thing is also, it really helps if you're outside too in some ways.
Yes.
And I think part of what we all, I mean, while it might appear that Gail was ignored, Gail herself never felt ignored, because she took herself very seriously as a social scientist who spoke to Kasegaon. It was important for her that whatever transpired in Kasegaon was as important as whatever transpired, as Ranjana was saying, in Brazil or China or elsewhere. I mean, you do speak to that immediacy of your context while drawing from various sources. And then she was very much a product of her generation in doing that. And personally speaking, for me, my connection with my vernacular world has been as important as anything else. That being part of this universe has been a very important aspect of anything we think and do also.
See, Gail was there as an intimate part in every conference, everything which was held in Pune. So I kept hearing in her accent Kasegaon all the time. But she was never part of what we taught in class. It was only these Andre Bete and cinemas, like you said.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's the sad part. Like we couldn't have a seminar in any, either in political science or in sociology, anywhere without Gail and Bharat Patankar being there. It was always there, but I don't know who read her and who tried to incorporate. They were very limited because
Yeah, I do know that there are courses in
now maybe, yeah.
some women studies courses teach reinventing revolution at least.
See, Sharmila kind of transformed, at least in Pune University, the way things were taught. But before that, I'm saying my other colleagues, even Dhanagre was teaching social movements and all that, but Gail never found a mention in
Right.
any of his
Though
classes.
she engaged with Danagre considerably.
Uh,
I think we could change this
yeah,
trajectory now.
your generation has to. I was also thinking that we'll start our master's program because we have stop our MPhil program now,
Right.
and we are starting masters. So if you could find time and maybe next when we start the masters, spend some time and teach some of our students. When we have sociology, it'll make a
No, I think we should
yes.
draw up a syllabus where we
Okay,
actually treat thinkers who've been writing about society but who
okay.
are not really been part of the institutional development of disciplines. And I think both are valuable. Institutional development of disciplines is equally important because also need to have a sense of where you moved from, 15 years ago to now. But at the same time, that is enriched only by looking at what the world is doing, not just what institutions do. And if I would really think what would be very useful for all of us, if we were to do three segments of three kinds of syllabi where we teach what has transpired in post-independent India through the writings of public thinkers. You know, so Gail would certainly figure as one of them, but I would put someone like Dr. Balagopal there as well, and many others. And some of these might have to be translated from the vernacular also, apart from whatever we have in English already. And I think that would make for a very rich course because you'll actually see people who are moving between struggles, ideas, journalism, academic essays. As you said, Bhakti, Gail was doing that all the time. And I didn't have time, and also Hindu has put a paywall. But basically, you should all read her essays in the Hindu between 2000 and 2003. How much can you pack in an editorial page essay? Brilliant, both speaking to the uh, even as a form of writing, no, as a where you speak to the particular concern that you're addressing, you trace the history of those arguments, you also suggest, as all of you have said, what can be done, right? And it's very interesting. And there's one particular letter I read this morning to Bangaru Lakshman, the BJP Dalit president of that time, telling him why he ought not to be in the BJP. These are gems because they are immediate, but they also give you this sudden burst of history and philosophy and everything all at once. So I think public thinkers who did that should form a part of the learning culture of any university. And there are many number of public thinkers in India who've done that in the vernacular. Periyar himself wrote only in public journals, no, he was not a learned man, he studied until class 2. So Ambedkar, of course, is very different, but Ambedkar also wrote for public journals. Wrote in Janta, wrote in Bombay Centennial. He wrote continuously in public journals. So that would be interesting, Kushal, if we can actually structure, especially for the period between 60s and 90s, it becomes very important.
So we would need your help then to
I'll be
structure it.
very happy to suggest things that you can read, films you can watch. And I do actively want us to put films and music into those courses. People are roused by music, people respond to music. And as somebody, and Bharat was saying, it was so moving the other day that Gail, after she had all these issues with recognizing people and with, actually remembering things, there's one thing that she responded to, it was music. She could still sing. And it was so profoundly moving to hear that every time somebody sang, she would join in. Suddenly, something from within her would respond. Made me want to cry, but it was also that how we ignore things that shape consciousness, no? And music we should think of, and what a rich repertoire we'll come up with as something for students to stay with. I mean,
I think all these discussions happening between communists themselves. I mean, especially in Maharashtra, they become very important. I mean, generally when we are taught sociology, we generally engage with classical theory or something as you said, Delhi based, written by people who are based in Delhi or Calcutta. But I think this rich literature which exists in vernacular languages, in Marathi specifically, it becomes really, really, really important.
yeah,
And
absolutely, I agree completely, and I'm sure it's the case in many languages. So there shouldn't be this division between vernacular and English, nor should English be seen as the only repository of wisdom. So, to be able to be multilingual is great, but not at the cost of ignoring your immediate
mother tongue.
vernaculars. No? So let's do a public educational course on the thought of the 60s to the 90s. That'll be so much fun. We can have different people teaching it, you know.
I'll get in touch with you once it the
To do
coaching
that.
starts.
We'll
Yeah,
talk more
yeah.
about it. No, no, this is so much fun to do. I mean, just the fact that you had Deepa here talking about her films and watching her films, Ranjana coming in with her own engagement with the women's movement. A course should ideally have space for all of this, no? And not just talking, seeing, listening, and better speeches. I mean, extracts from a public speech could make a very. I mean, in Tamil Nadu, for example, if I were to teach a course, I would certainly put in Annadurai speeches as part of the curriculum, because what you hear is very different from what you read. So we can think creatively also about how to take this. This is a very small effort at bringing films and text together. And it so happened that Deepa and Gail have shared from a shared generation, partially at least. So, Deepa, would you want to say something before we wind off? Are you there? Just need to be there.
Yeah. I'm here. I'm here.
You want to say a few
No,
words?
I've been listening.
Ah,
Just that my every we've had no power for some three
oh,
hours.
yeah, raining, no,
I've paid
heavily.
attention to. I've listened to everything. So
No, I wondered if you wanted to say something before we wind up.
no, I just want to thank you for this these amazing sessions and also the students and just the opportunity to attend has been really fantastic. So I just wanted to thank you for that.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. Yeah.
I would like to, Deepa, if I can
Mhm.
just mention this. Have you all seen Deepa's We Did Not Come Here to Die on Rohit Vemula and everything? Maybe request you to suggest where the film can be watched.
I can send the link to the
Yeah, I
group.
think it's a very important film because it captures this moment of Bahujan Dalit intellectual resistance, focusing on Rohit Vemula's story. So I would highly recommend that we watch the film. So maybe to your general email address, Deepa, that you've been
Yeah.
getting communication from. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I have a request.
Yes, Jay.
So I haven't been able to watch all the films that were shared with us. So I was wondering if the link could be kept active for another week.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yes, Ananya.
Um, I just wanted to say a couple of things. One is that all this talk about what is academic, what is not academic, and I was thinking that this itself feels a little bit outside of academia to me, in the sense that it's not part of an institutional curriculum, and it's not in that I'm not really here because this is squarely in my area of research that I'm currently doing. But so it feels like a, uh, I don't know, something related to academia, tied to academia, but also a little like there's an element of life as well as I don't know if leisure is the right word, but leisurely thinking. I mean, with some taking some time, and I just wanted to say that I'm really thankful to you and also to Deepa and Ranjana, because I think being able to read Gail along with as with the others, I mean, together has sort of animated this whole thing for me in a way that I don't know. I think I've learned more. I remember more, and also. Um, I'm very excited about the course already that you discuss and that you are thinking of, and um, I don't know. I feel as if it is hard to stay in academia right now because of many things. It's generally a little depressing, but also to be in academia when um, this particular political, historical, and also moment is difficult. And so to have the reason to stay necessarily has to speak to has like speak to that part of life that is sustainable. So whether it's relations or communications or uh, watching a kind of syllabus which is not just limited to very sort of well-worn kind of syllabi. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say. And also in that regard, I think the reason why participation has dimmed is also because of the institutional requirements, because currently we are in the APS season, and we have everyone's writing annual progress seminars and busy doing all of that. So I think it's in a I mean, I don't know if I'm allowed to extend an apology on my other fellow students' behalf, but yeah. So I'd be happy for a course like this and the one that you were talking of. And I just wanted
Yeah, it's institutional constraints are very real. I mean, students have that many working the hours and that many days to do stuff. But also, I think it's useful to understand how sometimes you need to buckle that trend also. This is what the Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars did. They said, look, we can't do this anymore. We need to do this slightly differently. And how may we do it differently? Maybe we didn't have enough time and, stuff to plan around it, and we did think everybody would be able to actually make it. But I don't think it would be fair to just blame the students for not coming. But it's also that maybe other enabling conditions have to be created for them to participate, because last year when lockdown started, I did this open course on Let's Read Ambedkar for 10 lectures, and I had an average of 100 students. It started with a very large number, and it was across countries. So people came when they had because I think also lockdown had shocked all of us. We all sort of were trying to find some ways of dealing with it, but it also proved enabling. Maybe enabling conditions are important, and how do we do that? Something going forward we can all think about. And but one other thing is, academic life is what it is, but let's also not forget that in the Indian context, it's also in one sense a hopeful time in academia, because never before have we had such a density of Bahujan, Dalit, or women students. And I think it's important to therefore nurture academic structures in whatever ways we can, because these students are not going to be able to afford private universities. You can't. Look at the prices, look at the cost of things involved. Even if some of them are given scholarships, a public university is what remains within the purview of the Indian citizen, no, for the most part. So I think how do we rejuvenate these structures? And I think it is entirely logical. The Hindu right will want to work against the grain of serious academic thought at a time when a mass of people are coming into academia who have never been in these spaces before. I mean, clearly, this it's very evident. So I think that's also important. How do we rejuvenate it? How do we think of different ways of doing it? How do we even work with these private universities to make sure that somewhere they are accountable, because see, after all, they are all on land my taxpayers money pays for. They are being given subsidies which is taken away from so many other things. So ultimately they must all be publicly accountable, no? And that's what Gail talks about the private sector also. While there are things that, as Ranjana said, it's very hard to think capitalism can be humane, as Gail imagines sometimes, but it's equally important to hold that sector to account, not simply rail against it. And how do you hold it to account? I mean, recently a private university asked me what should we do to increase diversity. I said it's so simple. The only time honored method we have is reservation. I mean, to start with, that's not ultimate, but that's where you start with. But that's something they don't want to deal with, right? So you can't have the politically correct possibility of reservation without wanting to accept caste as real. I mean, how do you do it? They said, "Oh, but our donors will never agree." Then I said, "There's no shortcut to it. I mean, there is no shortcut. How do you do this? Unless you identify students from Dalit Bahujan backgrounds and take the trouble to bring them into your university. Are you willing to do that?" So these are all things where which again and again remind us public spaces have to be nurtured. I mean, because private universities may teach Gail even, but you may not have Dalit Bahujan students reading Gail. And I think we want both, right? So
Jay, you want to say something? Or you joined back, is it?
yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, I just joined back. My internet connection's a bit.
Yeah,
I had some thoughts
yeah.
about this. Uh, so since we are looking at a highly regimented kind of expectation from like researchers within humanities and social sciences, uh, like with like private universities and also like the general uh, expectation from these so-called prestigious universities for number of publications and uh, like to just make you merely uh, eligible for continuation of your work. I think that's like, I don't know, I'm probably saying precariousness which has already always existed, but I'm also a little unsure about how that helps us seriously engage with the things that we are interested in. Matlab, in the way that Gail Ombet has also engaged with so many things, uh, I think there is a very strong anti intellectual environment in which we are also living, and it's kind of difficult to keep sight of these hopes while or even pushing oneself to write. So, yeah, I that was just a comment. It was not really a question.
Sorry, I just lost connection. Like
It's okay.
Deepa, it's raining here also. So
It's okay, no problem.
No, Jay, you can repeat what you were saying. Huh?
I just heard the first part of what you said, Jay. Then I
So I was just stating that along with the influx of so many people into academia, there is also an increased regimentation of uh, work within academia. There's more casualization, informalization, and uh, at times like this, it becomes even more difficult to keep in uh, touch with what you want to study and not be just bounded by what you have to study. So uh, like it was very uh, I was really glad to hear that Rupali is writing on Fule right now, and I mean that kind of uh, motivation as well as the uh, drive that we would like is often not available. So and those who actually tend to go against that grain are somehow thrown out of academics. G. Aloysius, who has written so nicely about nationalism, has hardly had space within
right,
academics.
right. Yeah, and I think increasingly, on one hand, you have casualization, as you say, and really the dismantling of public universities in a fundamental sense. In the regions we have faced it much earlier in some ways, but I think what is also happening is that increasingly academic debates are becoming very limited to what I call the culture of citation. You cite me, I'll cite you. It is really not about learning, and it's becoming this highly industrialized, standardized way of making your way through the academic maze. A young student recently sent me a proposal that he had written, and I knew that this was not him. Why was he writing this proposal? I mean, And he said, "No, ma'am, but this is a language that will actually fetch me admission in a prestigious university." But I said, "Where is the room for passion, for whimsy, for interest?" He said, "I'll have to bide my time because I can't do it right away. And the pressures are very real. And he's a first generation PhD scholar. He's from a peasant family. He's not Dalit, but even for non Dalits who are from small town village backgrounds, to access higher education is not easy. And when you're almost there, what do? How much can you fight these protocols? And I think that the kind of intellectual stranglehold these protocols have established, um, they need to be seriously challenged. I mean, as you said, why are you not teaching Aloysius? What is the reason? He's no less scholarly. It's not that he doesn't know what he's saying. He has footnotes, he has references. I mean, so I think it's that incestuous cycle of citation, no, which is also what is at stake here. But I think the pandemic, for all its horrors, has also shown us a way of lateral connections. I think the internet has broken some of these things. It's also spaces are getting more hybridized in terms of even writing. So you can actually write in, say, Caravan or something where you can have a rigorous argument without it necessarily having to be academic. So I think those are all things to be also hopeful about and see how we can stretch those spaces and make them work for us. So
Thank you.
I feel many of the spaces, I mean, especially university spaces, they have been challenged in many ways after actually Rohit Vemula movement.
yeah.
I think that thing of history, sad thing, but still it has really changed. Even I think Dalit Bahujan students' attitudes towards fighting for their own rights, fighting for their own, whatever problems they face, whatever challenges they face, and even universities now they look at the student differently, and they understand the cruciality, or I mean, what fierceness students bring along with them. Even the representation in these spaces become important of the students. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think that has been the most important and hopeful development for me, really. That in a democratic sense, knowledge is sort of open in a way it has never been done in the past. I think though that's a very important development, and Deepa's film actually captures it. I often tell her that the way these students theorize on camera is amazing. Rohit Vemula's comrades, those who were on a fast with him, and the way they actually talk about their own situation, it shows you the enormous creativity of the Dalit movement, and you see that on camera. And what would Gail tell us? She would say, learn. Don't see it in hostile terms. Don't see it only in critical terms. What is it telling you about the world, and how might you actually think about the world differently? And the resolution that you all have pointed to, that she's always saying something, looking for something. That's because she's an eternal learner, no? She's constantly saying what. And even in a very sharp critique of the left's attitude towards capitalism, she says Marx did not. She goes back to Marx. She says, how did Marx understand capitalism? As a dynamic system, as something which transformed lives. So you should be looking at the logic of transformation and not just taking positions. So I think constantly she was doing that, and she's a wonderful pedagogue also that way. As a teacher, how do you actually learn? How do you see systems as dynamic? How do you understand that there is always room for conflict, contradiction, which will then make things seem less given, less structured? No, so that's what I like about her work. That you, shall we call it a day?
Yeah, I think so. So, Rupali, you want to say something?
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. I would just like to thank you for organizing this wonderful, I mean, sessions. And I'm just overwhelmed with the amount of learning I think all of us have done with each other by reading Umbit's work. So, and thank you, Professor Deb, for initiating this idea and for building that dialogue with Dr. Geeta and making this event possible.
He was persistent. I initially said I sort of slid off, but he reminded me after a month exactly.
Yeah, because I am out of academics now last 1.5 years. So for me, this has been very rejuvenating, to again start reading and doing things.
Yeah.
I've become a clerk otherwise.
I'm pushing some of our publishers to do a Gail with reader, so hopefully we'll be able to put everything together soon.
Uh-huh.
So
Yeah, that would be great.
let's see. Let this bad year of pandemic pass, and people will have more resources next year.
It would be wonderful to have your actual essays on the way you structured the course. If you could
Ah,
write an introduction on that, it would be really
yes,
great.
I'm anyway going to start putting that reader together for my own interest. So,
Okay.
and much of it is in the public domain. It's EPW essays and all that. I mean, I don't think EPW will mind, as we use. It's only these other essays we need permission for, bulletin and all of that. And she wrote a great deal in the American magazines, so that's important. So yeah. Anyway, thanks a lot for this. It's been very nice speaking to all of you, and we'll stay in touch and see what we can do together over
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
next few
Now I won't
months and so
let
on.
go of you. I'm going to
No, no,
keep
let's
hounding
do
you.
something about the swinging 60s in India.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, 60s and 70s and 80s in India. So, and thanks, Deepa, for
Yeah, thanks a
letting us
lot.
watch your films. So, and,
Oh, you're welcome. I'm so happy that there was a chance to, especially to watch the earliest work from the
yes,
80s.
exactly, because they're not available anywhere now. So, yeah.
Thank you,
Okay.
Deepa
Thank you so
Janaji,
much.
and thank you to all the participants
Thank you.
also.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thanks, Rupali. Thanks a lot. And we'll stay in touch, all of us.
Yes.
And
Yes.
bye, Ranjana. Thanks.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye bye,
Bye.
everyone.